"What would you like to order, sir?" The billionaire looked up, his heart pounding in his chest. She had aged, there was no denying that. But her eyes were unmistakable. Swallowing hard, he whispered, "Miss Eleanor?" She froze, the tray she was carrying rattling slightly. It couldn't be. She hadn't heard that name in decades. Her breath caught in her throat. "It's me," he said softly, almost pleadingly, "the boy you once saved." A wave of confusion, followed by a flicker of recognition, washed over her face. She had no idea what was coming next. Ethan Hayes sat alone in his high-rise office, the glittering expanse of the New York skyline stretching out before him like a concrete ocean. The city that never slept pulsed with life beneath him, cars moving like tiny ants, neon billboards flashing promises of success, the hum of endless ambition lingering in the air. He had spent his entire life chasing that ambition, building an empire from the ground up, transforming himself into a name that commanded respect in every boardroom across the globe. Tonight, however, something felt different. He swirled the amber whiskey in his crystal glass, the golden liquid catching the dim light of his desk lamp. He should have been celebrating. The billion-dollar deal he had just closed would solidify his company's dominance in the industry, crushing the competition. But instead of reveling in his victory, he was lost in a memory of a small, cramped classroom, a memory of her. Miss Eleanor Carter. The name struck him like a jolt of electricity, as if it had been locked away in the deepest recesses of his mind for years and was now suddenly demanding to be remembered. He hadn't thought of her in so long, yet tonight her face appeared so vividly in his mind that it almost felt like she was standing right there in the room with him, her kind eyes filled with unwavering belief. She had been more than just a teacher, she had been his savior. Ethan hadn't always been a billionaire, a titan of industry. There was a time he rarely spoke about, when he had possessed nothing, when survival was a daily struggle. Growing up, life had been a constant uphill battle. His mother had worked multiple jobs, cleaning houses and waiting tables, barely able to put food on the table. His father had disappeared before he was even old enough to remember his face, leaving behind a legacy of debt and despair. There were nights when he had gone to sleep hungry, his stomach aching with emptiness. Mornings when he had walked to school in shoes that were 2 sizes too small, his toes peeking through the worn fabric, a constant reminder of his poverty. And school had felt like a dream slipping through his fingers, a privilege he couldn't afford. When he had first realized that his mother couldn't afford his school fees, a crushing weight settled on his young shoulders. He had made up his mind to drop out, to abandon his education and find work, any work that could help his mother pay the bills. He had already started looking for small jobs, delivering newspapers, stocking shelves, anything that could earn a few extra dollars. He had convinced himself that education wasn't meant for kids like him, that his future lay in backbreaking labor, not in classrooms filled with books and ideas. But then came Miss Eleanor. She had noticed him when no one else had. She had seen the way he would sit in the back of the classroom, too proud to ask for help, but too desperate to ignore the lessons. She had seen him pretend to take notes in an empty notebook, his pencil moving diligently across the blank pages, a charade he hoped would mask his inability to afford the necessary supplies. And instead of ignoring him, like so many others had, she had stepped in, a beacon of hope in his bleak world. One day after class, she had called him over, her voice gentle and reassuring. "Ethan," she had said, her eyes filled with concern, "I spoke to the principal. Your school fees have been paid." He had frowned in confusion, his brow furrowed with disbelief. "What? How?" She had simply smiled, a warm, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "That's not important. What's important is that you stay in school. You have a bright future, Ethan, and you deserve the chance to pursue it." He had been too young, too naive, to fully understand what she had done, the extent of her sacrifice. But as he grew older, he realized the truth. She had paid for it herself. She had used her own meager salary to make sure he stayed in school, to ensure he had a chance at a better future. She had bought him books when he had none, quietly placing them on his desk before class, no questions asked. She had stayed after hours to help him when he struggled with his lessons, patiently explaining complex concepts until they finally clicked. She had believed in him, even when he had stopped believing in himself, when the rest of the world had written him off as just another poor kid with no future. And now, decades later, he owed everything to her. His success, his wealth, his entire life, was built on the foundation she had laid. Ethan leaned back in his leather chair, running a hand through his impeccably styled hair. How had he let so many years pass without finding her, without thanking her for her selfless generosity? Had she ever seen him in the newspapers, on television, in business magazines, the face of a self-made billionaire? Had she ever realized that the young boy she had saved had become one of the most powerful men in the world? He needed to find her, to express his gratitude, to repay the debt he had carried for so long. Reaching for his phone, he dialed his assistant's number, his fingers trembling slightly. The line rang once before a professional, efficient voice answered. "Yes, Mr. Hayes. I need you to find someone for me," he said, his voice steady but his heart pounding in his chest. "Of course, sir." "Who?" "Her name is Eleanor Carter," he said, the name resonating in the silence of the office. "She was my teacher. I need to know where she is now." A pause, a moment of consideration. "A teacher?" "Yes, sir. I understand." He could hear the clatter of keys as his assistant began the search. "And I don't care how long it takes," he added, his grip tightening around the phone. "Find her. I need to know that she's all right." The first place Ethan went was her old house, a modest two-bedroom home in a quiet, working-class neighborhood. He remembered walking past it as a child, staring at the small flower garden she used to tend with such loving care, imagining what it must be like to live in a house that felt like a home, a safe haven from the harsh realities of the world. But when he knocked on the door, a stranger answered, a middle-aged woman with a weary expression. "Miss Carter?" Ethan asked, trying to keep the urgency out of his voice. "Does she still live here?" The woman shook her head, her eyes devoid of recognition. "She moved out years ago. I don't know where she went." Ethan's stomach twisted with disappointment. He had expected her to be here, had imagined her opening the door, seeing him, and instantly recognizing the boy she had once saved. But reality wasn't always so kind, and he knew that the search wouldn't be easy. His next stop was the school where she had taught, the same school where he had received the education that had transformed his life. The moment he stepped through the old gates, a wave of nostalgia washed over him. The same rusting lockers lined the hallways, the same cracked asphalt covered the playground where he had once played, dreaming of a future bigger than this place. He could almost hear the faint echo of children laughing in the distance, the sounds of a life he had left behind. But when he walked into the main office and asked about Miss Eleanor, the answer broke him. "She doesn't work here anymore," the receptionist told him, barely looking up from her computer screen, her voice flat and indifferent. Ethan frowned, his brow furrowed with confusion. Did she retire? A man standing nearby, an older teacher with tired eyes and a world-weary expression, shook his head sadly. No, she was fired. Ethan's entire body tensed, his muscles coiling with anger. Fired? What happened? The teacher sighed, rubbing his temples wearily. She had personal issues at home. She was often absent or late. The principal at the time, well, he didn't care about her struggles. He let her go, said she wasn't reliable anymore. Ethan clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white. The woman who had sacrificed so much for her students, the woman who had dedicated her life to shaping young minds, had been discarded like she was nothing, cast aside by a callous administrator who valued efficiency over compassion. The injustice of it made his blood boil. Where is she now? He asked, his voice sharp, demanding an answer. Where can I find her? Silence hung in the air, a heavy, uncomfortable silence. The receptionist avoided his gaze, pretending to be absorbed in her work. The older teacher looked away, as if ashamed to admit the truth. Just as he was about to leave, defeated and disheartened, an older woman stepped forward, her eyes narrowed in thought. She squinted at him, tilting her head slightly, as if trying to place his face. Wait a minute, she said, her voice hesitant. I know you. Ethan turned toward her, his pulse quickening with a surge of hope. You do. She nodded slowly, as if piecing together a long-lost memory. You're Ethan Hayes. You were one of her students. A long time ago. He swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. Yes, he said, his voice barely audible. And I need to find her. I need to know that she's okay. The woman's face softened, her expression filled with a mixture of sadness and admiration. She talked about you all the time, you know, she said softly. She was so proud of you. She always knew you would do great things. His throat tightened, making it difficult to speak. Then please, he pleaded, his voice filled with desperation, tell me where she is. I need to see her. The woman hesitated for a moment, her eyes filled with a mixture of concern and reluctance. Then, after a long, heavy sigh, she relented. She works at a small diner now, she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. On the outskirts of the city. As a waitress. The words hit him like a punch to the gut, a crushing blow that knocked the wind out of him. A waitress? The woman who had once dedicated her life to shaping young minds, to inspiring generations of students, was now serving tables, pouring coffee, and cleaning up after ungrateful customers? The thought made his stomach churn with anger and shame. He didn't wait for more details. He turned and walked out of the school without another word, his mind racing, his heart aching with a mixture of guilt and determination. He had one last stop to make, and he had a feeling that this was the most important journey of his life. Ethan's sleek black limousine pulled up to the small, unassuming diner on the outskirts of the city. The neon sign above the entrance flickered weakly, casting a dull yellow glow onto the cracked pavement below. The diner, a humble, roadside establishment with faded paint and worn signage, was a far cry from the towering skyscrapers and lavish restaurants where he usually conducted business. The sight of it made his chest tighten with a mixture of sadness and resolve. He had envisioned something different for her, a quiet, comfortable retirement, a life of peace and contentment, surrounded by books and flowers, not the chaos of a bustling kitchen or the weight of carrying heavy trays to impatient customers. But life had been unfair to her, had rewarded her selflessness with hardship and disappointment. She had spent her youth shaping futures, lifting up students like him, and in return, she had been discarded, forgotten by a society that valued profit over people. Taking a deep breath, Ethan pushed the car door open and stepped out into the cool night air. The night air wrapped around him, carrying the scent of exhaust fumes and frying grease, but he barely noticed it. His heart pounded with anticipation, his mind racing with memories. With every step toward the entrance, he felt himself walking back in time, to a different life, a different world, a different version of himself. He reached for the door handle, his hand trembling slightly, and pulled it open. A soft chime rang out, announcing his arrival to the small restaurant. The warm scent of coffee and freshly baked bread filled the air, a comforting aroma that evoked memories of simpler times. The place was simple, cozy, but it had clearly seen better days. The walls were slightly faded, the booths worn from years of use, the linoleum floor scuffed and stained. A few tired waitresses moved between the tables, serving the handful of customers who were still lingering inside, nursing their coffee and sharing quiet conversations. And then he saw her. Miss Eleanor Carter. She was moving carefully between the tables, her hands full, a tired but patient smile gracing her lips as she placed a plate in front of an elderly man at the counter. She had aged more than he had expected. Her once dark hair was now streaked with silver, pulled back into a loose bun at the nape of her neck. Her frame was thinner, her face etched with lines of hardship, but her presence, the quiet strength that had always defined her, was still there, radiating from her like a warm, comforting glow. His heart ached. This wasn't where she belonged. She didn't deserve this life, this endless cycle of serving others and receiving so little in return. His fingers curled into fists as he watched her, his anger growing with each passing moment. This woman had given him everything, and now it was his turn to repay the debt, to make sure that she was finally taken care of, that she could finally live the life she deserved. She turned, wiping her hands on her worn apron, and walked toward his table, her movements slow and deliberate. She hadn't recognized him yet, didn't see the transformation, the man he had become. "Good evening, sir," she said warmly, pulling out a notepad from her apron pocket. "What can I get for you?" Ethan stared at her, his chest tightening with emotion, his voice caught in his throat. He couldn't find the words to express the gratitude, the admiration, the love he felt for this woman. And then, in a whisper, barely audible above the din of the diner, he said the name he hadn't spoken in years, the name that held the key to his past. "Miss Eleanor?" She froze, her smile faltering, her brow furrowing with confusion. It had been decades since anyone had called her that. She blinked at him, studying his face, searching for a clue, a flicker of recognition. And then, like a bolt of lightning, recognition hit her, her eyes widening with shock and disbelief. Her lips parted, her hand flying to her mouth, and her notepad slipped from her fingers, landing on the table with a soft thud. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It can't be." Ethan swallowed hard, his own eyes misting over with tears. "It's me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "the boy you once saved." A sharp gasp escaped her lips, her hands trembling as she reached for him, her fingertips brushing against his sleeve as if trying to confirm that he was real, that he wasn't just a figment of her imagination. "Ethan," she choked out, her voice thick with emotion. He nodded, his jaw tightening to keep the emotions at bay. Tears welled up in her eyes, spilling over her wrinkled cheeks as she let out a shaky breath. "My God, look at you." He reached for her hands, his touch gentle but firm, holding them in his own. "I've been looking for you," he admitted, his voice filled with regret. "For so long." Her shoulders shook as she tried to hold back a sob, her body trembling with a mixture of disbelief and overwhelming emotion. I always wondered where you went," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "What happened to you?" "I hoped." She wiped at her tears, laughing softly through her sobs. "I always believed you would do something great. You were always so bright, so determined." He smiled, though it trembled slightly, his heart overflowing with gratitude. "I wouldn't be here without you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You gave me the chance to succeed, the opportunity to make something of myself. I owe you everything." She shook her head, squeezing his hands tightly in her own. "Oh, Ethan, you did this," she whispered, her eyes filled with pride. You worked hard. You never gave up. You earned your success. No, he interrupted gently, his voice firm but kind. You did this. You saw me when no one else did. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. You fought for me. You sacrificed for me. You gave me a future. And I never even got to say thank you. Her breath hitched in her throat, her eyes overflowing with tears. You don't owe me anything, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the din of the diner. Just seeing you here, seeing what you've become, that's thanks enough. But he did owe her, more than he could ever put into words. He owed her his success, his happiness, his entire life. And he was determined to repay that debt, to make sure that she finally received the recognition and the gratitude she deserved. He pulled a small envelope from the inside pocket of his expensive coat and slid it onto the table, his eyes meeting hers with unwavering sincerity. This is for you, he said softly, his voice filled with emotion. She glanced down at the envelope, her brow furrowed with confusion. Inside, she knew, was a check, a substantial sum of money that would change her life forever. She knew it was his way of thanking her, of trying to repay the debt he felt he owed. But she also knew that she couldn't accept it, not after all these years, not after everything she had sacrificed. $1 million, she read, her eyes widening in shock and disbelief. Ethan, no, I can't accept this, she stammered, her voice filled with disbelief. It's too much. I don't need it. He frowned, his expression filled with disappointment. He had expected this, had known that she would resist his generosity. She had always been selfless, always unwilling to take more than she needed, always putting others before herself. But he wasn't leaving here without making sure she was taken care of, without ensuring that she could finally live the life she deserved. He leaned forward, his voice low and persuasive. Then let me buy this place for you, he said, his eyes meeting hers with unwavering determination. She looked at him, startled, her eyes widening with surprise. What? This diner? He nodded firmly, his voice leaving no room for argument. Let me buy it for you. You own it. No more struggling, no more exhausting shifts, no more working for someone else. You'll be in charge. You can run it however you want, hire whoever you want, and finally enjoy the fruits of your labor. Her hands trembled, her body shaking with a mixture of disbelief and overwhelming emotion. Ethan, she said, her voice barely a whisper. That's too much. I can't ask you to do that. He shook his head, his expression softening with a mixture of love and gratitude. You spent your whole life giving, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Now it's time to let someone give back to you. You deserve it. You've earned it. She hesitated, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope, her mind struggling to comprehend the magnitude of his offer. She had always been independent, always worked hard to provide for herself, always refused to accept charity from others. But the thought of owning her own business, of finally being her own boss, of escaping the endless cycle of poverty and hardship, it was a dream she had long since abandoned, a hope she had buried deep within her heart. Emotions warred within her, fear and doubt battling against a glimmer of hope and a longing for a better life. She knew that accepting his offer would change everything, would transform her life in ways she couldn't even imagine. But she also knew that she couldn't refuse, not after all these years, not after everything he had done for her. And then, after a long, heavy pause, she nodded, her eyes overflowing with tears. All right, she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. I accept. A week later, the papers were signed. Eleanor Carter, former waitress, was now Eleanor Carter, owner of Eleanor's Diner. The diner was still small, still unassuming, but it was hers, and she had big plans for its future. She wanted to create a place where everyone felt welcome, where the coffee was strong, the food was homemade, and the conversation was always lively. She wanted to create a community, a gathering place where people could come together to share their stories, their laughter, and their tears. Ethan stood outside the newly renamed Eleanor's Diner, watching as she greeted customers, not as an employee, but as the heart and soul of the place. She looked younger, happier, lighter than he had ever seen her. The weight of years of hardship had seemed to lift from her shoulders, replaced by a newfound sense of purpose and fulfillment. She turned toward him, her eyes still filled with unshed tears, her smile radiant with gratitude. I don't know how to thank you, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. You've changed my life, Ethan. You've given me a new beginning. He smiled, his voice equally thick with emotion. You already did, he said softly, his eyes meeting hers with unwavering sincerity. A long time ago. She chuckled softly, wiping at her eyes with a corner of her apron. I always knew you'd be someone special, she said, her voice filled with pride. You always had that spark, that drive, that determination to succeed. His throat tightened, his emotions threatening to overwhelm him. I had a great teacher, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You taught me everything I needed to know. You showed me the importance of hard work, perseverance, and believing in myself." As he turned and walked away that night, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, something more profound than success, more powerful than wealth. He felt peace. He knew that he had finally repaid the greatest debt of his life, not with dollars and cents, but with kindness, compassion, and a deep, abiding gratitude for the woman who had believed in him when no one else did. He understood, with absolute clarity, that true wealth wasn't measured in money or power, but in the connections we make and the lives we touch. And he knew that he had made the right choice, that he had finally found a way to honor the legacy of Miss Eleanor Carter, the woman who had saved his life and shown him the path to a better future. His heart, once burdened by guilt and regret, now felt light and free, filled with the warmth of gratitude and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that he had finally done the right thing.